Sarah.
Thanks everyone for participating in those breakout rooms. I'm going to hand it over to Aaron to help facilitate the report outs.
Thank you. I will be handing it over to myself because I think we're group number one, and I've been voluntold to report on group number one, which is BC. And I'll just prefix, I grew up in BC, love BC, very strong ties, but haven't lived there for about 7 years. So take what I'm about to summarize kind of as a grain of salt, but representing the folks from our working group that are living there and working there. So there's a really, I think, common agreement on the need to have these sort of metrics and priorities reflect individual needs and priorities. And those are going to vary quite a lot, region by region, community by community. And so having, I think, space for multiple levels of priorities and metrics across however we set that agenda for the province is going to be important to have things that are kind of scalable and trackable at the provincial level, but things that are also then realistic and important at the local level, whether that's jobs created or people engaged in training programs or industries developed, cultures restored. And so again, really thinking beyond area, how we capture this suite of things that you're doing when you restore a kelp forest, because it is, or protect a kelp forest, it's so much more than just that marine alga that's coming back. And allowing, I think, for non-numeric metrics, if that makes sense. It's a bit of a contradiction, but having kind of case studies or summaries or videos that accompany the quantification, it's kind of like, a number is a statistic, but behind that, we can have a whole story that represents that statistic or illustrates that. So allowing space for that non-quantitative to accompany the quantitative in how we report out against these goals. And then I will pass it to group number two.
I think that's
that
Alaska, correct? Okay, cool. That's me then. Yeah, so I'm Angie representing group number two, Alaska. So we kind of talked about two or three main topics. So the first one we really talked about was like priorities for conservation. And the short answer is it's not really a priority right now in Alaska. There's just not really a lot of like there's just not a lot of prioritization at the state level. So for conservation and restoration, partially just because there's not really seemed to be a strong need for restoration. We still have pretty abundant, pretty robust kelp forests. And so as a result, it's actually like pretty hard to just get funding for surveys and just basic biodiversity monitoring. Instead, the main focus in Alaska really is mariculture. And so how do we increase that industry? How do we grow that industry? And so that's where kind of most of the research on seaweed and kelp is coming in. That being said, that doesn't mean that restoration is not going to be concerned in like the next, 10 years or so as climate change continues. And so one of the primary focuses like that we kind of need is just a baseline for like where do we find kelp, like when is it available and all of that jazz. There's some baseline research that exists from like the 80s or like the early 2000s, but there's not really a large amount of like recent baseline data that's available. And then we also talked about like the need for even just like a research group of everybody involved in Alaska so that we can start sharing some of those resources. The other topic we're kind of talking about is what targets, like global and regional targets, are actually achievable. And so it's one of those things where just due to the culture and, not necessarily the need for conservation and restoration not really being recognized, the targets that are achievable are less, protecting specific amounts of area. We don't really have any MPAs right now. We don't really foresee any MPAs being introduced in the near future. That being said, though, there is still like a very large reliance on the ocean. So some things that are really being focused on are reduction of oil and plastic pollution. There's a lot of focus on that in the state. There's also a lot of focus on number of people employed. A lot of the reason that people are getting into kelp aquaculture is that they see salmon and fish stocks declining. So they're trying to provide more jobs and more employment to people who are being displaced by the shrinking of those industries. And then there's also talk about using regenerating farm, or like using farms as a aspect of regeneration. Like, can we count the footprint of the farms as contributing to some of those like global and regional goals, because they might be generating fish habitat. But one of the things that we need to, include kelp regeneration as a part of these targets is really just time and data. There's a lot of research actively being done looking at the environmental impacts of kelp farming in Alaska. A lot of that research is still underway. So the data is not quite there yet, but it hopefully will be in like the next year or two. So we just need like a little bit more time to generate that data and really prove that farming can be a part of these, global conservation targets. And I think that's it, unless I missed any.
Fantastic. Thank you, Angie. And group number 3 is Washington.
All right, this will be fun. I just finished going through our notes, so hopefully this works. Again, any of my group, if you want to chime in, please do. So we had pretty good conversations that kind of meandered through all the different questions. Regarding priorities for kelp conservation, a big thing for Washington is the human values in addition to the ecological values, making sure that everybody's brought along for the journey, that we really focus on collaboration, making sure all voices are heard, that we focus on communication and storytelling, though it's important to realize that the communications are going to need to vary depending on the audience. But that is also a priority for us. And shifting the priorities based on the scale. We will have certain priorities at the state level, but also different priorities potentially at the local level. And at the local level, those priorities can change from site to site. It does not mean that you throw out this statewide scale priorities, because they can coexist. But you definitely want to consider both scales when moving forward. And so yes, priorities do shift at the local level from the state level, or they can. And then also, what types of targets might we set? And one thing that was brought up a lot is that a lot of these area targets might not be as effective as, say, focusing on some of more of the targets of effect, or looking at the progress indicators, if you will. One could be like capacity, looking at how we are increasing capacity of different groups and organizations so that we can increase additional efforts for kelp conservation recovery. And that might be a little easier to track than, say, some habitat improvements, which are a little bit more difficult to track. And that canopy area might not be the only solution for a metric, but again, involving some of those human-based metrics could be helpful. Yes. Does anybody else from the group have anything else they want to throw in there? I guess the other thing too is just celebrating the wins as we move along, not just celebrating the end goal, but also the little milestones along the way.
Never say no to a celebration. Thanks, Jeff. Group number 4 is Oregon.
Yeah, I'll kick us off here. Tom Calvanese is going to jump in. The other participant we had was Scott Marion, and we were ably led by Sarah Orfino too, which is great. We talked a lot about, I think, the idea of this, is this policy driven for kelp restoration or kelp, or is it community driven? I think we lean more on the community level drivers here, because that's really where things are happening in Oregon. That's really where it's first detected, is coming from local communities along our coast, especially on the south coast. We also started looking, and we talked about the area-based targets and were they effective. We noted that sometimes they scared people off, but they certainly were useful for raising awareness as well. So that was something that we know is an important thing. But in terms of these actual numbers, they were sometimes just way out there in terms of what could actually be achieved or even were realistic and these things. So they had some real downside. We also were discussing at least the rapid response for the kelp loss in Oregon, which was a great thing to see. But we noted that we probably didn't spend near enough time in our state to an early detection. So again, more monitoring really is needed. And this kind of goes back to maybe employing these communities up and down the coast to act more in terms of acting as monitors for these factors that were occurring, at least on a month-by-month basis. And certainly Scott Marion from ODFW said that's something they were looking at and were interested in maybe employing too. And again, the Oregon way is not to expect the state to cover for us, but maybe to help on some of these ways. So that would be a real great role to have the state help organize some of this monitoring that's really desperately needed up and down our diverse state along the coast. Ideas where to act, always a concern, especially when you start having good places that need attention. And we started recognizing that we can do a lot of work at certain places for kelp restoration, but there's a real need for spore dispersal, and thinking about, well, you can do a lot of removal of urchins, but without spores there to replace and grow kelp in these sites that have been recently had impacts reduced or so, we may not get far. So we needed to start thinking about dispersal. And the dispersal conversation kind of brought forth ideas about connectivity. So you're talking about dispersal, you need to think about connectivity up and down our coastline for what does this mean? Where can we be working? And that has a lot of aspects in terms of is connectivity issues changing with climate change impacts too. So we were cognizant that there's a real knowledge gap of information that we have currently we're working with, and we're going to keep learning. So even though we have certain things we know how to do right now, there's more to learn. And as we learn, we probably are going to have to redo and go back and look at some of the things we did previously. So this is going to be a continuing effort for all of us, for a whole new fleet of graduate students and community practitioners too. So I think that's the exciting part, but this knowledge base is going to be, I think, keeping us in check and probably giving us some surprises down the road. And Sarah then brought us back around at the end, which was great, to remind us that we had to think about metrics. So we were looking at metrics, and this was mentioned just recently too by others, that community metrics in terms of what communities are getting, how they're getting engaged is an important thing. The idea of ecosystem function is a great metric to start looking at, more than just acres overall, but ecosystem function. Again, metrics in terms of monitoring. Are we getting more monitoring and information gathering efforts in place, as well as putting them into reasonable knowledge bases in these things? And then finally, ideas of permits or pathways for permitting to make some of the work that we are trying to do maybe more expedient, to maybe have it a more experimental mode, and that maybe helps the agencies participate in ways that allow this to go forward. So these are things that we had great discussions about. The time went fast. Tom, what did I all miss?
You missed nothing, Dick, because you're so thorough a thinker and a communicator. And it was a very lively, small Oregon discussion. So everyone had a chance to really be heard. And I think you did a great job of summarizing it. And I'll just put out an emphasis on working with coastal communities in Oregon who know what's going on and where it's happening, and honestly need the work. And this is work, as you all know. And so I'll leave it with that. And thanks again, Dick and Scott and Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Team Oregon. Next, we have group number 6, which is California 1, led by Riley.
I was also voluntold to report out as the note taker, which tends to happen. So I'll do my best here. Our group really talked about what's the scale that we're looking at, and adding more metrics of success outside of acres. You know, the people that are doing the work, the industries that can help find solutions, indigenous presence and their knowledge. We talked about monitoring and diving programs as well with the workforce, and the stewards and folks who are inspired by the work and become active within, their communities. So capacity, workforce development, industry, community engagement, and stewardship are all important metrics to try to capture as success. We talked about funding and goals that can be global, but in reality, those actions are very local, and being grounded in achievable goals at a local scale can really help to level up to global goals. The scale of the targets are important. Jen Cassell had a great point of they were doing a project with 1 acre of restoration was the goal. If you look at that at a global scale, that is essentially nothing, but in a local scale, that is a lot, and you can learn a lot from it. So seeing those metrics at a smaller scale can really help to inform the story and see those things as success. The drivers of success in projects will also be very different. And to get the kelp back, there are a ton of other goals to get there as well. So we talked a lot about helpful organizers are important. The Peace Corps initiative was brought up as being a group that is an example of this, and using a multi-species approach to roll up efforts, lessons learned, large pots of funding to spread out among species and monitoring that may not get the spotlight in major funding as a solo species. You can able to pool this large pot of money and spread it to where it really is helpful among multi-species that will get to kelp restoration. We also talked about setting targets without knowing the resources and achievability. You might be doing more actions that aren't fully thought out because you are trying to quickly make this happen. So doing a good job in achievable areas versus big goals, and grounding in the achievability to gain momentum, to gain positive spotlight and see these impacts positively is really important moving forward.
Great. Thank you, Riley. California number 2, group 7, led by Izzy.
And Erin, before we move into those, we have about 3 minutes left. So California groups, if there's, let's just add on to those that last group's notes, and we can wrap it up in the next few minutes.
Perfect.
Oh God. Okay, here we go. So group 7. I think adding on to what was just said, we spoke a lot about the uphill battle that we're against, where the greater society that we live inside does not make regular everyday life easy, let alone thinking about kelp and resources that maybe most people aren't directly connected to. So we talked a lot about wanting to really stay or build up support from a local level. In particular, when we look at Australia's response to what went on the Great Barrier Reef and how Korea responded to their kelp forest with billions of dollars of investment compared to California, Oregon, everybody put together, we have far fewer resources going into this than other countries that really bought into the ownership of that resource. So trying to figure out how to build that up. And in California in particular, with the changing of the guard, potentially as a director of CDFW and new governor, having the opportunity to really put our kelp thumb down with big community campaigns, try to get a little earworm out there of a kelp forest service that is out there and is able to make sure that all these various restoration efforts at the community level can scale up. And like Riley said, starting from a small area, you get to your bigger area by having the community feel empowered, give people jobs, give people money and time to really buy the kelp in, and you build up from there. And then we can reach the bigger goals and kind of mimic how the indigenous communities used to view the kelp as a part of their family and not just a resource. Okay.
Love the Kelp Forest Service.
Yeah. A kelp forest service, exactly. Yeah. I want the patch. This is the main thing. I'm all about
Boy
the swag.
Scouts. Yeah. Ben, last one in -1 minute.
1 minute is all I got. I'm going to go fast here. Anyway, the important thing we talked about was better ways of monitoring the kelp other than Kelp Watch is important, and also to pay attention to the subsurface kelp. The subsurface kelp is something that's often ignored, but it's something that survives in the warmer water. So the surface canopy kelp is really impacted by the warm water, and the sub canopy is not as much. So it's really important to find ways to monitor that. Reef Check does some of that. We get the community involved. The tribes can get involved. The recreational divers can get involved. We need to track that. And as far as getting kelp back in California, there's two kind of distinct environments going on. There's one where we have a problem where there's no starfish, there's no lobster and no sheephead, and specifically Northern California down to San Miguel. In those areas, we have a sea urchin problem. In the areas further south, the reason the kelp is not thriving may be something else. Maybe water quality, it's hard to say, but it's a different strategy. So also we have concerns that the overall goal of 30 by 30, if you're just talking about creating more SMRs, it's counterproductive to kelp because we have a lot of areas in California that are SMRs, but the kelp's doing terrible because there's too many sea urchins. You can't do anything. You can't do restoration. You can't remove the sea urchins. You can't grow kelp there. So the idea of the 30 by 30 in the state MPAs needs to be reconsidered as part of the adaptive management. We need to go back to the decision makers, and the scientists need to explain that you're not going to have thriving kelp inside an MPA if you don't allow humans to help. And humans are part of the environment. They've been part of the environment. The tribes have known that for years. The tribes wouldn't have areas where you can't do anything. Anyway, so getting down the line. So again, we need to develop restorative fisheries. Restorative fisheries can provide jobs and food supply. And we can do that by harvesting purple urchins, ranching them, getting the food product out of there, developing the market for purple sea urchins. And that goes a long way for jobs and food supply. And that's very important and it's also can be self-sustaining. It doesn't involve as much government funding. It could help with some government or NGO funding because starting new things is difficult. So it's important to do that. So again, we want the tribes involved. We want to see starfish, the Pycnopodia replanted in the areas where it's died off. We need to have these restorative fisheries built. And we have concerns about the overall policy of just saying, let's create a bunch of state marine reserves. And if we make a bunch of state marine reserves, everything will be good. And that's not the case. We've all seen that just because it's an MPA doesn't grow kelp. So again, problems with sea urchins. And if it's a state marine reserve and we want more of them, that's against kelp. So the kelp should be specifically, how do we get more kelp? How do we get understory algae? And we can and how do we track it? And we do need funding for this. Of course, we need funding. We need funding to do, especially the story algae is going to be harder to count because you have to send divers out there.
Yeah.
Anyway,
great. Thanks, Dave. I'm going to have to
sure, no problem.
chime in to give Aaliyah a chance to close off, but that's really good. And I think we're hearing a lot of different priorities. Some of them are unique to specific geographies. Some of them are shared across different geographies. And that's a lot to start to think about as we go forward. And so before I pass it back over to Leah, just thinking about how you want to go forward, there'll be a poll or a survey that comes out after the workshop. And so there'll be an opportunity to indicate if you're interested in continuing to participate in these working groups to build on what we've talked about today, bring other groups in, grow that sort of community of practice within your region, identify different targets, sub-targets, all these sorts of things that we're talking about, and then importantly, really come together on how we can actually make all of that happen and think about how we get money and support to achieve building the goals and targets and then also achieving those goals and targets. So really appreciate everyone's brainstorming and hive mind as we try to tackle this large societal problem that is environmental degradation, ocean degradation, kelp loss, and bring it all back into healthy harmony. So I'll pass it over to Aaliyah, and thank you all very much.